When Adam first bought the small coastal home in Coral Bay, he thought he had found paradise. The house sat on a quiet lane overlooking the sparkling blue water, with tall palms swaying lazily in the breeze and gulls calling out across the harbor. Every morning, he would sip his coffee on the porch and watch fishing boats glide across the horizon. It was the dream he had worked his entire life to reach, a peaceful retirement spot by the sea. For the first few months, life was exactly that. The neighbors were polite, if not overly friendly, and the community seemed as picture-perfect as the postcard views. The Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining coastal harmony, their phrase for strict rules about everything from paint colors to mailbox shapes. Adam didn't mind. He'd lived under HOAs before and knew that following the guidelines kept things smooth. At least that's what he thought. His pride and joy was his old boat, a 26-foot white and blue fishing vessel named Mariner's Calm. It wasn't fancy, but it carried memories. Adam had rebuilt it with his late brother years ago, every plank and bolt a reminder of long summer days spent together on the water. After moving to Coral Bay, he parked it neatly on his own driveway, covered it with a protective tarp, and washed it every weekend. To him, it was more than a boat. It was a piece of family history. For almost a month, nobody said a word. Then came her. Karen Sanders, president of the Coral Bay HOA, lived directly across the street. Her house was the largest on the lane, a pale cream mansion with imported tiles, manicured hedges, and a constant smell of bleach wafting from her driveway. She had the kind of personality that could sour milk and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Her husband, mostly absent, worked overseas, leaving her with nothing but time to control everything within her line of sight. The morning it began, Adam found a bright yellow notice taped to his mailbox. It was an official warning from the HOA, stating that visible marine vehicles were detracting from the uniform beauty of the community. He was stunned. His boat was parked neatly on his property. It wasn't blocking anyone's view, and the tarp kept it clean. Surely, there had to be some mistake, but there wasn't. Over the next week, the tone escalated. More letters arrived, each one written in the same passive-aggressive tone, citing obscure HOA bylaws that Adam had never even seen before. He noticed Karen watching from her window every time he stepped outside, her arms folded tightly, her lips pressed into a thin, judgmental line. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact. Some whispered and pointed when Adam drove by. The HOA had clearly started spreading rumors, claiming his boat was devaluing nearby homes and blocking the coastal aesthetic. It was absurd, but in Coral Bay, gossip traveled faster than the tide. Adam tried to reason with the HOA in writing, explaining that the boat was part of his livelihood and that he was fully compliant with local regulations. The response came swiftly. Another warning and a threat of daily fines if he didn't remove the boat within 14 days. He felt a slow burn rise in his chest. Not just anger, but insult. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. About one woman's obsession with perfection and power. Still, he stayed calm. He moved the boat slightly further down his driveway, closer to his garage, and repainted the tarp a neutral gray to make it blend better. He even trimmed his hedges and cleaned the driveway to eliminate any excuse. But none of it mattered. One morning, as he was tightening the tarp ropes, Karen approached. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement. Though her lips moved, her eyes never softened. She gestured toward the boat with theatrical disgust, clearly enjoying every moment of superiority. She pointed, wagged a finger, and left with a smug tilt of her chin that a few hours later, another notice arrived, this one labeled Final Violation. It stated that failure to remove the unauthorized structure would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. That night, Adam couldn't sleep. The ocean breeze drifted through his open window, but all he could think about was the injustice of it all. He'd followed every rule, respected every boundary, yet he was being bullied in his own home. He looked across the street toward Karen's house, where the lights were still on. Through the curtains, he could see her pacing, phone in hand, likely discussing his boat issue with her inner circle of HOA enforcers. Something inside him shifted. The peace he'd come here for was gone. Replaced by a cold clarity, he started researching the HOA bylaws in detail, combing through every clause and subclause late into the night. And there, buried deep in the dense legal language, he found it, a loophole. The rule forbidding visible boats applied only to permanent parking or storage on driveways visible from the public road. It said nothing about temporary relocation on private property facing other directions. In fact, it never specified which side of a home counted as a public-facing view. The next morning, Adam stood in his driveway, looking at his boat. The sunlight glinted off its tarp, and the air smelled of salt and possibility. Slowly, deliberately, he backed his truck up, hitched the trailer, and turned the boat around. Not to move it away, but to move it directly in front of Karen's panoramic living room window. By noon, Mariner's Calm sat perfectly parked across the street, legally within his property line, but facing her house head-on. The tarp fluttered slightly in the wind, reflecting sunlight straight into her bay window. It was a harmless gesture, but symbolically devastating. The neighborhood noticed immediately. Curtains twitched. Someone snapped a photo. Karen's pristine morning coffee view of the ocean was now replaced with a very clear, unavoidable image of the one thing she hated most. Adam's boat, the afternoon. Her rage was visible even from a distance. She stormed in and out of her house, clutching her phone, gesturing wildly toward the boat. The HOA sent another letter, but this time Adam was ready. His polite response cited the exact bylaw number, highlighting the phrase, visible from the public road, and noting that his boat was fully within compliance. He even included photographs proving it wasn't visible from the street, only from one very specific house. That night, as the sunset cast gold across the water, Adam sat on his porch, sipping tea, watching Karen's blind slam shut. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. He could feel the storm building, not from the sea, but from across the street. And in Coral Bay, storms had a way of washing up more than just sand. The days following Adam's quiet act of defiance unfolded like a slow-burning drama that gripped the entire neighborhood. Coral Bay had always been a place where gossip spread like sea mist, light, invisible, and impossible to contain. The sight of Adam's boat, now facing directly toward Karen's grand living room window, became the talk of every evening walk, every coffee chat, and every HOA side meeting to most neighbors. It was amusing, a man standing up to the all-powerful HOA president without ever raising his voice. But to Karen, it was war.at first. She tried to ignore it. Her blinds remained tightly shut, her morning jog skipped, her outdoor garden tea sessions canceled. Yet her silence didn't fool anyone. People saw her pacing her porch with her phone glued to her ear, gesturing sharply as though scolding invisible subordinates. The HOA's board meetings doubled in frequency, and new letters began to flood Adam's mailbox almost daily. The first few were predictable, vague reminders about community harmony and aesthetic integrity. Then came the threats of fines, though none referenced any specific bylaw violations. Adam simply filed them away in a neat binder, labeling each one by date, rule, and signature. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was building a record. Behind his calm exterior, Adam had begun to understand the kind of person Karen really was. She wasn't just fussy or proud. She was obsessed with control. Every lawn had to match, every mailbox had to gleam, and every neighbor had to follow her lead. The community didn't run under the HOA's rules. It ran under Karen's mood. And Adam, unknowingly, had challenged her throne. It wasn't long before her tactics grew more personal. One morning, Adam found a group of strangers standing near his driveway, taking photos of the boat. They wore matching polos with the Coral Bay HOA logo. They whispered, pointed, and scribbled on clipboards. When he approached, they scattered without a word. The next day, a notice arrived, a demand for independent appraisal due to community visual impact concerns. Adam chuckled. They were getting desperate. He continued living as though nothing was wrong. He kept his property spotless, repainted his fence, and even planted new shrubs. But every day, he left that boat exactly where it was, directly in front of Karen's window, shining like a mirror in the sun. He made sure it was clean, polished, and entirely within code. Every visible inch of it screamed compliance. Meanwhile, the tension built like pressure under the waves. The HOA board, clearly acting under Karen's direction, tried to amend the bylaws in secret meetings. They proposed new wording that would classify any visible marine vehicle from adjacent lots as a violation. But such a change required a community vote, and by now, the community wasn't on Karen's side. Whispers began to circulate about her arrogance. How she'd fined elderly residents for small cracks in their sidewalks. How she'd forced a single mother to repaint her house 3 times in 1 year because the color didn't blend well with the coastal tone. People were tired of her, and Adam's quiet resistance gave them something they hadn't had before: courage. Then came the turning point. One Saturday afternoon, a storm rolled in from the sea, fast and fierce. Rain lashed the streets, and the wind howled through the palm trees. Adam secured the boat carefully, double-checking the ropes, while lightning flickered on the horizon. Across the street, Karen stood under her porch, phone in hand, shouting into the wind. She was probably calling someone, maybe another HOA member, maybe code enforcement, maybe just anyone who'd listen. When the storm reached its peak, a loud crash echoed through the lane. Something had fallen. A tree limb, perhaps, or a loose fence. Adam stepped out to check once the rain eased. What he saw made him pause at Karen's prize front fence. A hand-carved wooden piece imported from Italy had collapsed under the force of the storm. Several planks were scattered across her yard. Mud streaked across her pristine driveway. It wasn't severe damage, but it was messy, and messy wasn't a word Karen tolerated. Within hours, she was outside in her raincoat, yelling at 2 contractors. Even through the storm, Adam could see her glare flicking toward the boat, as though she blamed it for everything. The next morning, a letter appeared in his mailbox again. This time, written in red ink, IT accused him of obstructing neighborhood drainage with his oversized vehicle, claiming that the boat's placement had altered runoff patterns, indirectly leading to property damage. The claim was absurd. The storm had hit the entire coast, and his boat sat uphill from her house. But it was clear she was grasping at anything. That's when Adam decided to stop playing defense. He spent the next week collecting evidence. He took photos of the entire street after the storm, showing fallen branches, clogged gutters, and puddles. Not a single one related to his boat. He printed HOA guidelines, county maps, and drainage blueprints. He even found weather reports that proved the rainfall had been unusually heavy. Then, he did something Karen never expected. He shared it all, not with the HOA, but with the residents. He wrote a calm, detailed letter to every homeowner in Coral Bay, explaining the situation factually, how he'd been targeted, how the bylaws had been twisted, and how he'd discovered the attempted rule change. He didn't mention Karen's name, but everyone knew. Within days, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People stopped avoiding Adam and started waving again. A few even stopped by to chat, offering quiet support. Karen's influence was unraveling. Her control depended on fear, and fear fades quickly when someone shows it can be beaten. Still, she didn't back down. The next week, Adam received notice of an emergency HOA meeting regarding ongoing violations and community disputes. It was clear what the meeting was about. That evening, as the sun sank behind the water, Adam sat on his porch and looked at the calm sea. The sky glowed orange and pink, and Mariner's Calm stood in perfect silhouette against the horizon, its bow pointed straight at Karen's darkened windows. He knew she was watching, and for a brief moment, he almost felt pity for her. But pity couldn't erase what she'd done, or what she planned to do next, because behind her closed blinds, Karen wasn't defeated. She was plotting, and the next HOA meeting would show just how far she was willing to go to win back control. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with an uneasy stillness. The air was heavy with humidity, and the scent of salt drifted through the open windows of the Coral Bay Community Hall. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a small wooden podium draped in a banner that read, "Preserving Coastal Harmony, HOA Monthly Session." But this meeting was anything but routine. The moment Adam walked in, every head turned. Neighbors he barely knew before now smiled politely or nodded in quiet solidarity. Word of his letter had spread far beyond his street. Many had come out of curiosity, but some came out of anger. Not at him, but at the HOA itself. At the front of the room stood Karen, dressed sharply in a cream blazer that matched her rigid posture. Her stack of papers was neatly aligned, her expression calculatedly calm. But her eyes betrayed her. There was a twitch of irritation she couldn't conceal. To her, this wasn't a meeting. It was a public trial, and she was determined to emerge victorious. The first 30 minutes were filled with routine updates, landscaping schedules, community events, pool maintenance. The usual fluff. But everyone was just waiting for the real topic. Eventually, Karen cleared her throat and announced, in her most rehearsed tone, that item 6, violation review, 142 Seaside Lane, would now be discussed. That was Adam's address. Karen began with a long monologue about visual disruption, neighborhood standards, and property uniformity. She spoke with the confidence of someone who expected no challenge, tossing in vague legal phrases as though she were a judge rather than a neighbor. She described Adam's boat as unsightly, unapproved, and detrimental to community value. Her words were smooth, but her voice trembled slightly. Then, when she was done, she gestured toward Adam and said coldly, "Would the resident like to respond?" Adam stood. He wasn't a man used to speaking in front of crowds, but the calm that had defined him since this began never wavered. He thanked the board and began not with emotion, but with evidence. He laid out each letter he had received, each photograph, and each section of the HOA bylaws, including the original clause that only restricted boats visible from public roads. Then he presented photographs taken from the street, showing clearly that the boat was not visible to anyone except those directly across from him, namely, Karen's property. He even included drone shots to prove it. The room began to murmur. Karen interrupted twice, trying to steer the discussion, but the other board members asked her to let him finish. Her face tightened, her lips pressed thin. Then Adam handed out copies of the proposed bylaw amendment Karen had tried to push through without a full community vote. It bore her digital signature and a date, 1 week after she began sending him fines. A document that, if passed, would have given the HOA unprecedented control over what residents could have in their own yards. That'd be why the time he finished, the silence was deafening. Even the ceiling fans seemed to stop spinning. Finally, one of the board members, a quiet man named George, who had served for years without ever opposing Karen, cleared his throat. He said that, based on the evidence, Adam was not in violation of any current HOA rules. Several others nodded in agreement. A vote was taken right there, and the decision was unanimous. Adam was cleared of all charges for the first time in years. Karen's composure cracked. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose in a brittle, shaky tone as she tried to salvage authority. She accused the board of setting a dangerous precedent, of allowing negligence, even of personal bias. But her words fell flat. The community had seen enough. Then someone from the crowd spoke up, an elderly man who had lived in Coral Bay since it was first built. He reminded everyone of the time Karen fined him for painting his shutters too glossy. Laughter rippled through the room. Another resident stood and recounted how she'd been written up for leaving her recycling bin out for 1 extra hour. More laughter. And then another. The stories poured out like floodwater breaking a dam. Years of resentment, frustration, and silent compliance came rushing forward. Karen tried to speak again, but her voice was drowned out by the rising chorus of residents demanding change. Someone suggested holding a new board election. The room erupted in applause. The meeting adjourned in chaos, but not the kind that frightened Adam. It was a cleansing kind of chaos, the sound of people reclaiming their community. The next morning, Karen's blind stayed closed. Her car didn't move from the driveway. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors that she had resigned from the HOA board, though no one had officially confirmed it. What was confirmed, however, was that Adam's name had become something of a legend in Coral Bay. The man who stood up to the HOA, Queen, and WON in the weeks that followed. Things changed. The HOA rewrote its bylaws to be more reasonable, removing vague clauses that had allowed abuse of power. Community barbecues returned. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began talking again. For the first time, Coral Bay actually felt like a community, not a dictatorship disguised as 1.as for Adam. Life returned to the peace he'd originally sought. Every morning, he'd sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, the sound of the waves rolling in. Mariner's calm gleamed in the sunlight, still parked proudly in front of his home, still pointed toward Karen's now permanently shuttered windows. But one evening, something poetic happened. Adam noticed a for sale sign go up in Karen's yard. It stood tall, bright, and impossible to miss, the same way his boat must have looked to her all those months. He watched quietly as a moving truck arrived days later. She didn't wave. She didn't look back. She just left. When the truck disappeared down the hill, Adam smiled softly and looked out toward the ocean. The breeze was gentle again. The neighborhood was quiet. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Coral Bay was truly calm. The next morning, the sunlight reflected off the polished hull of his boat, casting a shimmer across the street where Karen's house once stood. It was peaceful, poetic, and perfectly fitting. Because in the end, the view that once bothered her so much became the very symbol of freedom she could never control. And for Adam, that was all the revenge he ever needed.